Have you ever wondered what it takes to turn pain into purpose? To rewrite a story the world tried to define for you? In a small southern town, where whispers carried more weight than words, two people dared to dream bigger than their circumstances. A diner owner with calloused hands and a heart full of hope. A runaway with nothing but grit and a secret she couldn't face. Together, they didn't just survive, they sparked a fire that changed everything. But this isn't just their story. It's yours too. Because somewhere in their struggles, you'll see pieces of yourself, the doubts, the courage, the moments that force us to choose who we want to become. Hit subscribe and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss how love, resilience, and sheer willpower can rewrite even the harshest narratives. And when you're done, let us know, what would you do if the world said no? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. Let's start the conversation. You ever had one of those moments in life where everything just shifts? Like the ground beneath your feet cracks open, and suddenly you're standing on a whole new world? Yeah, that's what happened to Caleb. And it all started with a rainy night at his little barbecue diner tucked away in the heart of South Carolina. Caleb wasn't always the kind of guy who owned a restaurant. He grew up poor, real poor, hand-me-down clothes, hand-me-down dreams. But he had this thing for cooking. His mama used to say, "Boy, if you could turn smoke into gold, we'd be rich." Well, maybe not gold, but Caleb turned his love for slow-cooked ribs and tangy sauces into something special. He opened Caleb's Smokehouse, a tiny diner right off Main Street. It wasn't fancy, just red-checkered tablecloths, mismatched chairs, and the smell of hickory wood drifting through the air. Folks around here called it home. And Caleb? He was happy. Or so he thought. It was one of those nights, the kind where the rain doesn't stop, and the streets are slick with reflections of neon signs. Inside the diner, Caleb wiped down the counter, humming an old country tune under his breath. Business was slow, only a couple of regulars sat hunched over their plates, nursing cups of coffee. Then the bell above the door jingled, and she walked in. Her name was Naomi. She looked like she'd been through hell and back. A faded denim jacket clung to her shoulders, her boots were scuffed, and her dark hair stuck to her face from the rain. She hesitated by the door, scanning the room like she wasn't sure she belonged there. Caleb nodded toward her, offering a small smile. "Come on in," he said. "Can't let you freeze out there." Naomi shuffled to the counter, avoiding eye contact. Her voice trailed off, and Caleb saw the shame flicker across her face. "I don't have any money," she admitted finally, her words barely above a whisper. "But I can work for it. Wash dishes or something." Now, Caleb had seen plenty of people come through his doors over the years, some desperate, some proud, some broken, but there was something about Naomi that struck him. Maybe it was the way her hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the counter. Or maybe it was the quiet dignity in her voice, even when she was asking for help. Whatever it was, Caleb didn't hesitate. "Sit," he told her firmly, sliding a menu across the counter. "Order whatever you want. No strings attached." She blinked at him, surprise written all over her face. "Are you sure?" "Positive," he said with a grin. "Just promise me you'll save room for dessert." Naomi ended up ordering the pulled pork sandwich with extra sauce and a side of coleslaw. As she ate, Caleb couldn't help but notice how she savored every bite, like it was the first good meal she'd had in weeks. When she finished, she thanked him quietly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Caleb waved her gratitude away. "No big deal," he said. "We've all been there." Later that night, after closing up shop, Caleb stepped outside to lock the door. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the parking lot glistened under the dim glow of the streetlights. That's when he noticed it, a beat-up sedan parked behind the dumpster. Its windows were fogged up, and inside, curled up on the front seat, was Naomi. For a moment, Caleb stood there, staring at the car. He felt a pang of sadness, for her, for the situation, for the fact that the world could be so cruel sometimes. He debated knocking on the window, inviting her to stay in the spare room upstairs, but something held him back. Instead, he grabbed a blanket from the storage closet and draped it gently over the windshield to keep the chill out. Then he went back inside, shaking his head. The next morning, word spread fast among the townsfolk. They weren't mean-spirited, exactly, but they were wary. "Who is she?" Mrs. Harper asked during breakfast, her sharp eyes narrowing. "And why is she hanging around Caleb?" "She's trouble," muttered Joe, the mechanic who came in every Tuesday for biscuits and gravy. "Mark my words, she's just using him." Caleb heard the whispers, of course. In a town this small, secrets didn't last long. But he didn't pay them much mind. Naomi stayed, helping out around the diner in exchange for meals, and eventually, a paycheck. She proved herself reliable, hardworking, and quick to learn. Over time, the gossip died down, though not everyone warmed up to her. But there was something else about Naomi that puzzled Caleb. Every now and then, he'd catch her sitting alone at a booth, staring at an envelope crumpled in her hands. It was worn, like it had traveled miles in her pocket. Once, he asked her about it. "Is everything okay?" he said gently. She flinched, stuffing the letter back into her jacket. "It's nothing," she muttered. But Caleb knew better. There was pain in her eyes, a weight she carried everywhere she went. Whatever was in that letter, she hadn't opened it yet. And so, life at the diner continued, until the day everything changed. Again. It was a quiet Tuesday evening at the diner, one of those nights where the air felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. The last customer had left hours ago, and Caleb was wiping down tables when Naomi appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, holding 2 plates of food. "I made us dinner," she said softly, almost shyly, as if asking permission to stay. Caleb looked up from his rag and smiled. "Well, I'd be offended if you didn't let me eat your cooking after all this time." He gestured toward the booth by the window, the one with the best view of the stars on clear nights. They sat across from each other, steam rising from their plates. For a while, they ate in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward but comfortable, a shared understanding between two people who didn't need constant noise to fill the gaps. Finally, Naomi broke the quiet. "Do you ever think about leaving here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Leaving? You mean South Carolina?" She nodded. "Yeah. Or just, this town. Don't get me wrong, it's nice here. Peaceful. But sometimes I feel like there's something bigger out there waiting for me." Caleb leaned back in the booth, studying her face. There was a fire in her eyes tonight, something he hadn't seen before. "What do you mean, bigger?" Naomi hesitated, picking at the edge of her napkin. "When I was little, my mom used to tell me I could do anything. She worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads, cleaning houses, waiting tables, even sewing costumes for the local theater. We didn't have much, but she always told me I was special. Beautiful, even." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "But beauty doesn't pay the bills, right? So I hid it. Baggy clothes, no makeup, kept my head down. I figured it was easier that way." Caleb listened intently, his fork hovering mid-air. He'd never heard Naomi talk about her past like this. She usually kept things close to the chest, letting only tiny bits slip out every now and then. Tonight, though, she seemed different, like she was finally ready to let someone in. "And now?" he prompted gently. "Now," she took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "Now I want to try modeling. It sounds crazy, I know. I'm not some polished city girl with connections or perfect Instagram photos. But I can't stop thinking about it. What if I could actually make something of myself? Something real?" Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Caleb felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd spent most of his life playing it safe, staying within the familiar boundaries of his small-town diner. But sitting here with Naomi, listening to her dream so fiercely, he couldn't help but feel inspired. Maybe it wasn't too late for either of them to chase something bigger. "You should go for it," he said finally, his voice firm. "If anyone can pull it off, it's you." Naomi blinked at him, surprised. "You really think so?" "I know so," Caleb replied with a grin. "Besides, who am I to stand in the way of destiny?" They laughed together, the tension easing slightly. But deep down, Caleb knew this moment would change things. Not just for Naomi, but for him too. Because as much as he tried to deny it, he was starting to fall, not just for her ambition, but for her. And that scared him more than he cared to admit. A few days later, the peace of the diner was shattered by the arrival of Lena Parker. Lena was the self-appointed queen of gossip in their little town, armed with a notebook and a knack for twisting stories into something juicier than they actually were. She strutted into the diner wearing oversized sunglasses and a smirk that made Caleb's skin crawl. Well, she drawled, plopping herself onto a stool at the counter. "If it isn't the infamous Naomi Carter. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Naomi froze, her hands gripping the tray she'd been carrying. "Questions about what?" "Oh, you know," Lena said breezily, pulling out her pen. "Your sad little story. Running away from home, living in your car, washing dishes for scraps. People are curious." The room fell silent. Caleb watched as Naomi's face flushed red, her jaw tightening. "That's none of your business," she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. Lena shrugged, unaffected. "Honey, everything's everyone's business around here." Before Naomi could respond, Caleb stepped in. "That's enough, Lena," he said sharply, slamming a coffee mug onto the counter. "You want a story? How about this one? Naomi works harder than anyone I know. She's rebuilding her life, and she doesn't need you turning it into some cheap tabloid headline." The diner erupted into murmurs. Some folks nodded approvingly, while others whispered behind their hands. Lena scowled, clearly annoyed at being called out. "Fine," she muttered, sliding off her stool. "But don't say I didn't warn you when her sob story turned sour." After she left, Naomi sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I hate this place," she muttered. "I hate how everyone stares, how they judge me without knowing a damn thing about me." Caleb knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Hey. Don't listen to her. You're better than that. Better than all of them." Later that night, Caleb ran into his old friend Mike at the gas station. Mike was a mechanic with a reputation for being brutally honest, sometimes to a fault. "So," Mike said, leaning against his truck, "what's the deal with this Naomi chick? Seems like trouble to me." "She's not trouble," Caleb shot back, defensive. "She's trying to turn her life around." Mike snorted. "Yeah, sure. And what happens when she decides small-town life isn't cutting it anymore? She'll break your heart, or worse, your wallet." Caleb clenched his fists, biting back a retort. He wanted to defend Naomi, to tell Mike exactly why she was worth believing in. But part of him wondered if maybe Mike was right. Was he setting himself up for disappointment? Despite the doubts swirling around her, Naomi refused to give up. She spent hours practicing poses in front of the cracked mirror in her car, scrolling through online forums for modeling tips and researching auditions. Finally, she found one, an open casting call for a local fashion show. Her hands shook as she filled out the application form, and her stomach churned as she drove to the audition site. The room was packed with girls who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a magazine. Naomi felt out of place, her worn jeans and simple blouse making her stand out in the worst way. Still, she held her head high, determined to give it her best shot. When her name was called, she walked onto the makeshift runway, her heart pounding in her chest. The judges barely glanced at her before scribbling something on their clipboards. "Thank you," one of them said dismissively. "We'll be in touch." Naomi forced a smile, nodding politely before stepping off the stage. But as she drove back to the diner, tears streamed down her face. She'd known rejection was possible, but it still hurt more than she expected. Back at the diner, Caleb noticed the sadness in her eyes immediately. "How'd it go?" he asked cautiously. Naomi shook her head, swallowing hard. "Not great," she admitted. "But I'm not giving up. Not yet." And for the first time in a long time, Caleb believed her. Whatever came next, he knew Naomi wouldn't back down without a fight. Neither would he. The days that followed Lena Parker's article were brutal. Gossip spread like wildfire, and Naomi became the talk of the town, not for her hard work or resilience, but for the narrative people had crafted about her. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was outright hostility. At the grocery store, Karen Malloy, who ran the register with all the warmth of a frozen fish, refused to serve Naomi altogether. "We don't need freeloaders in this town," she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Naomi stood there, clutching her basket of essentials, humiliation burning her cheeks. She wanted to snap back, to defend herself, but the weight of exhaustion held her tongue. Instead, she turned and walked out, leaving behind the stares and sneers. When Caleb heard about what happened, he stormed into the grocery store later that day, his voice sharp as steel. "If you ever treat her like that again, you'll have me to deal with," he said, glaring at Karen until she looked away. But defending Naomi publicly didn't stop the whispers, or the toll they took on her. The rejection from her first modeling audition had been hard enough, but now it felt like the entire world was conspiring against her. Still, she refused to give up. A few weeks later, another opportunity came along, an open casting call for a regional campaign. This time, she prepared harder than ever, studying videos of successful runway walks and practicing poses late into the night by the dim light of her car's overhead lamp. When the day of the audition arrived, Naomi walked into the room with more confidence than before. She could feel the judges' eyes on her as she moved across the stage, her posture straight, her smile steady. For a moment, she dared to believe she might actually stand a chance. And when they called her name to advance to the final round, her heart soared. Maybe, just maybe, she belonged here after all. But fate has a cruel way of crushing hope. In the end, she didn't make the cut. As the judges announced their decision, Naomi forced herself to nod graciously, though inside she felt like crumbling. Back at the diner, Caleb tried to cheer her up. "You made it farther than most people would've," he told her. "That's something to be proud of." "I know," Naomi replied quietly, staring down at her hands. "But pride doesn't pay the bills, does it?" Caleb didn't have an answer for that. Things only got worse when Caleb's mother, Evelyn, paid a surprise visit. Evelyn was a no-nonsense woman with piercing blue eyes and a habit of speaking her mind whether you wanted her to or not. She swept into the diner like a storm cloud, taking one look at Naomi and frowning deeply. "Is this the girl everyone's talking about?" she asked, her tone dripping with disapproval. "Mom," Caleb warned, stepping between them. "Don't start." Evelyn ignored him, fixing Naomi with a cold stare. "I raised you better than this, Caleb. Associating with someone who brings nothing but trouble? You think this is the kind of life you want?" Naomi flinched, her face pale. "Mrs. Thompson, Save it," Evelyn snapped. "People like you don't stick around. They take what they can get and leave the rest behind." With that, she turned on her heel and marched out, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. For days afterward, Naomi couldn't shake the sting of Evelyn's words. They echoed in her mind, gnawing at her confidence. Was she really just a burden? Someone who didn't belong anywhere? Then, one afternoon, Frank Reed showed up at the diner. Frank was the owner of Reed's Auto Repair, a gruff man with a reputation for being tight-lipped and intimidating. He rarely spoke, but his presence alone carried weight. He sat in his usual booth, sipping black coffee, his gaze fixed on Naomi as if trying to peel back her layers and see what lay beneath. He didn't say a word, but his glare said plenty. By the time Naomi clocked out that evening, she felt like crawling into a hole and never coming out. Sitting alone in her car, she stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her makeup was smudged, her hair messy from a long day's work. "Maybe I'm not model material," she whispered to herself, tears pricking her eyes. "Maybe I should just accept that I'll never be good enough." Caleb found her like that, slumped over the steering wheel, defeated. He knocked gently on the window, and when she looked up, his heart broke a little. Sliding into the passenger seat, he reached over and took her hand. "Hey," he said softly. "Don't listen to them. Not my mom, not Frank, not anyone. You're stronger than every single one of them put together." Naomi shook her head, her voice trembling. "But what if they're right? What if I'm chasing something I'll never catch?" Caleb squeezed her hand tighter. "Listen to me. Your dream isn't just some fleeting idea, it's part of who you are. It's your identity. If the world can't see that, then screw the world. We'll build it ourselves. One step at a time." His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. Naomi blinked at him, surprised by the fierceness in his voice. For the first time in days, the fog of doubt began to lift, replaced by a flicker of determination. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe the world didn't get to decide her worth. Not yet, anyway. And so, with Caleb by her side, Naomi resolved to keep fighting, for her dream, for herself, and for the belief that somewhere out there, the world would finally see her for who she truly was. It started with a whim. One night, after another long shift at the diner, Naomi sat on her bed, well, technically the back seat of her car, and scrolled through social media. She'd seen countless posts from aspiring models sharing their journeys, and something inside her stirred. Why couldn't she do the same? Grabbing her phone, she snapped a quick selfie in natural light, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, no makeup except for a swipe of lip balm. In the caption, she wrote, "Dreams don't care about your doubts." She hesitated before hitting post, her finger hovering over the screen. What if no one cared? What if people laughed at her again? But then she thought of Caleb's words, "If the world can't see it, we'll build it ourselves." Taking a deep breath, she pressed send. The next morning, Naomi woke up to notifications flooding her phone. Her post had been shared hundreds of times, and strangers were commenting with messages like "You're stunning." Keep chasing that dream. By the afternoon, her follower count had skyrocketed. One photo turned into 5, then 10, each one more confident than the last. For the first time in what felt like forever, Naomi felt seen, not as the girl living in her car or the diner worker everyone whispered about, but as someone with potential, someone worth noticing. Of course, Lena Parker couldn't resist jumping on the bandwagon. Within days, she published a follow-up article titled "The Girl They All Mocked is Going Viral." The piece was predictably snarky, dripping with thinly veiled disdain, but even Lena couldn't deny the obvious: Naomi Carter was becoming impossible to ignore. The newfound attention brought both blessings and curses. Caleb's diner saw an influx of customers, some coming to congratulate him, others to gawk or whisper behind his back. Karen Malloy stopped by one evening, leaning against the counter with a smug grin. "So, you really think this is going to last?" she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Fame has a way of changing people." Caleb ignored her, focusing instead on Naomi, who stood nearby organizing menus. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Later that night, after closing up shop, he took her hand and led her outside to the town's oldest oak tree, a sprawling giant that had stood there longer than anyone could remember. Its branches stretched wide, casting dappled shadows across the ground. "Naomi," Caleb began, his voice soft but steady, "I know things haven't been easy for you. And I know they probably won't get easier anytime soon. But I also know this, I want to be by your side through all of it. Through the highs and the lows, the cheers and the jeers." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple silver ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Naomi's eyes as she stared at him, disbelief mixing with joy. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've never been surer of anything in my life," Caleb replied, smiling. "Yes," she said finally, throwing her arms around him. 1,000 times yes. Their engagement didn't silence the critics, though. If anything, it fueled them. Karen Malloy muttered under her breath about how it won't last, while Frank Reed simply shook his head when he heard the news. Even Evelyn called Caleb later that week, her tone sharp with disapproval. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Mark my words, she'll leave you the second something better comes along." But the harshest blow came online. Beneath one of Naomi's viral posts, a racist comment thread erupted. Strangers attacked her appearance, her background, her very existence, spewing hate-filled words that cut deeper than any insult she'd faced before. Naomi tried to brush it off at first, telling herself not to let it get to her. But as the comments piled up, she found herself withdrawing, spending hours staring at her phone in stunned silence. When Caleb noticed her growing distress, he stepped in. He reported the worst comments and blocked the users responsible, but it wasn't enough. Then came the anonymous threats, messages sent directly to the diner, warning Caleb to stay away from her or face consequences. One note read, *, "She doesn't belong here, and neither do you if you keep defending her." *. Caleb burned the notes, refusing to let fear dictate his life. But he couldn't hide the worry etched into his face. "We'll get through this," he told Naomi one evening, holding her close as they sat together in the diner after hours. Together. Naomi nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "What if they're right?" she whispered. "What if I don't belong anywhere?" "You belong with me," Caleb said firmly, kissing the top of her head. "And that's all that matters." For now, they clung to each other, finding strength in their bond despite the storm raging around them. Because even in the darkest moments, love had a way of shining through, a spark of hope amid the chaos. The morning of the wedding was quiet, almost eerily so. Naomi woke up in her car-turned bedroom, the sun streaming through the cracked windows and casting golden patterns across the seats. Today was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life, but instead of excitement, she felt a gnawing sense of dread. She had known this day wouldn't be easy. Still, she hadn't expected it to feel quite so lonely. Caleb, ever the optimist, tried his best to lift her spirits. "Hey," he said softly as they prepared for the ceremony at separate ends of the diner-turned-venue. "It doesn't matter how many people show up. All that matters is us." "I know," Naomi replied, forcing a smile. But deep down, she couldn't help wondering if everyone else was right. If maybe their love really was too good to last. By the time the ceremony began, only 11 guests had arrived, most of them Caleb's regulars from the diner who had grown fond of Naomi over time. There were no fancy decorations, just wildflowers picked from the fields outside town and string lights strung haphazardly across the ceiling. Naomi wore a simple thrifted dress she'd found at a second-hand shop, a soft ivory gown with delicate lace sleeves that made her look like she belonged in a fairy tale, even if reality told her otherwise. As she walked down the makeshift aisle, arm in arm with an elderly neighbor who had agreed to stand in for her absent father, Naomi scanned the small crowd. Frank Reed wasn't there, just as she'd expected. Neither was Karen Malloy or any of the other townsfolk who had mocked her relentlessly. Even Evelyn sent her regrets via text, though Naomi suspected Caleb's mother hadn't even bothered typing out more than a few words. But then something happened that made her blood run cold. Midway through the ceremony, as Caleb took her hands and began reciting his vows, one of the guests, a middle-aged man named Harold who always sat at the corner booth, stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor, breaking the fragile silence. For a moment, it seemed like he might object, like he would voice all the doubts and fears swirling in the air around them. Instead, he simply stood there, his face pale, before muttering, "Never mind," and sitting back down. The tension in the room was suffocating, but neither Naomi nor Caleb let it break them. They exchanged their vows anyway, their voices steady despite the weight pressing down on them. When Caleb slid the ring onto her finger and whispered, "You're mine now," Naomi felt tears welling up, not because she was sad, but because she finally understood what true courage looked like. Afterward, there was no grand reception, no champagne toast. Just Caleb spinning her around under the string lights while an old country song played faintly from a Bluetooth speaker. They danced alone, holding each other tightly as if afraid the world might try to pull them apart. And for those few minutes, everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, lost in their own little universe. But the peace didn't last long. Later that evening, as they cleaned up the remnants of the wedding, Naomi's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen, her stomach dropping when she saw the message, *, "Your online profile has been flagged for review." * confused, she clicked on the link to find out why. That's when she saw it, the report filed by none other than Karen Malloy, accusing her of using stolen images and fraudulent content to gain followers. Naomi stared at the screen, her hands trembling. How could she do this, she whispered, showing the message to Caleb. He clenched his jaw, anger flashing in his eyes. "Because she can't stand seeing you happy. Because she'll do anything to tear us down." "But what am I supposed to do?" Naomi asked, her voice breaking. "This could ruin everything I've worked for." Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "We'll fight it," he promised. "Together. We've faced worse than Karen Malloy, and we're still standing." For a moment, Naomi allowed herself to believe him. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the stars through her car window, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of another battle, one that would test not just her dreams, but the very foundation of her new life with Caleb. Life after the wedding wasn't the fairy tale Naomi had secretly hoped for. Instead, it was a patchwork of struggles stitched together by love, and sometimes, even that felt like it was unraveling at the edges. Caleb worked double shifts at the diner, his hands raw from scrubbing dishes and flipping burgers. The diner's profits were dwindling, fewer people came in these days, either because they didn't approve of his marriage to Naomi or because rumors about her flagged profile had spread online. Whatever the reason, money was tighter than ever. Meanwhile, Naomi threw herself into chasing her modeling dreams. She attended casting call after casting call, each rejection chipping away at her confidence. "Why won't anyone give me a chance?" she muttered one evening, tossing yet another rejection letter onto the growing pile in the corner of their tiny apartment above the diner. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally, but he forced himself to sound supportive. "It's not you," he said gently. "The industry's tough. You just have to keep pushing." "Pushing? For what?" Naomi snapped, her frustration boiling over. "We can barely pay rent, Caleb. My Instagram following is tanking thanks to Karen's stupid report, and I'm starting to think maybe everyone's right, I'm not cut out for this." Caleb froze, hurt flashing across his face. He wanted to argue, to remind her how far she'd already come, but he bit his tongue. They'd been arguing more often lately, the stress of their situation wearing thin on both of them. Money, or rather, the lack of it, was always the elephant in the room. Dreams felt distant, almost unreachable, and the weight of failure loomed heavily between them. Desperate to contribute, Naomi started applying for local retail jobs. Surely someone would hire her as a cashier or sales associate, right? But every application ended in disappointment. At one store, the manager told her she was overqualified. At another, she was dismissed with a vague, "You're just not a good fit." It stung, hearing those words over and over again. Was she doomed to be stuck in limbo forever? Things got worse when Caleb's old friend Tom showed up at the diner late one night. Tom had always been a smooth talker, the kind of guy who could sell sand in the desert. He slid into a booth and motioned for Caleb to join him. "Listen, man," Tom said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "I've got this opportunity, a partnership deal. Big money, quick returns. All you gotta do is put up some cash up front." Caleb frowned, suspicion creeping into his voice. "What kind of opportunity?" Tom waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing illegal, if that's what you're thinking. Just business ventures. Trust me, we'd make enough to fix all your problems in no time." But Caleb knew better. He'd heard stories about Tom's so-called business ventures, most of which involved shady dealings and broken promises. "Thanks, but no thanks," he said firmly, standing up. "I don't need shortcuts. I'll figure it out my own way." Tom smirked, clearly unbothered by the rejection. "Suit yourself, buddy. Don't come crying to me when things go south." As Tom left, Caleb sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. Life felt like an endless uphill climb, and for the first time, he wondered if they'd made a mistake getting married so soon. Could two people really survive under this much pressure? Amidst the chaos, though, there was a glimmer of hope. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Naomi stumbled upon a post by Miss Yvonne, a retired fashion designer turned mentor known for helping aspiring models navigate the industry. Intrigued, Naomi reached out, explaining her situation and sharing her portfolio. To her surprise, Miss Yvonne responded within hours. "Your story resonates with me," the message read. *, let's schedule a meeting. I think I can help. *. Naomi stared at the screen, tears welling up in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a spark of optimism. She showed the message to Caleb, who managed a tired but genuine smile. "See," he said. "This is it. Your big break." "I hope so," Naomi whispered, clutching her phone tightly. "Because I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting like this." They held on to that sliver of hope, clinging to it like a lifeline. Because without it, they weren't sure they'd survive the storm raging around them. The meeting with Miss Yvonne took place in a small cafe on the outskirts of Charleston. Naomi arrived early, clutching her portfolio like a lifeline. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, choosing her best photos, practicing what she would say, but nothing could have prepared her for the woman who walked through the door. Miss Yvonne was tall and striking, with sharp cheekbones and an air of authority that commanded respect. Her silver hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, and her tailored blazer spoke of decades in the fashion world. As she slid into the seat across from Naomi, she wasted no time with pleasantries. "Show me what you've got," she said bluntly, gesturing toward the portfolio. Naomi hesitated, suddenly nervous. But as she flipped through the pages, Yvonne's expression softened slightly. "Not bad," she admitted after a moment. "But you're holding back." "Why?" I guess I'm scared," Naomi confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared people won't take me seriously. Scared they'll laugh at me." Yvonne leaned forward, her piercing gaze locking onto Naomi's. "Let me tell you something, girl. You don't need anyone's permission to be visible. If you wait around for validation, you'll be waiting forever. Confidence isn't given, it's built. And trust me, the world will notice when you stop caring whether they approve or not." Her words hit Naomi like a lightning bolt. For so long, she'd been waiting for someone else to tell her she was good enough, to give her the green light to chase her dreams. But maybe Yvonne was right. Maybe it was time to take control of her own narrative. Over coffee, Yvonne shared stories from her own career, the rejections, the battles, the moments of triumph, and offered Naomi practical advice. By the end of their conversation, she handed Naomi a business card. "There's an indie photographer looking for fresh faces," she said. "He's doing a shoot next week. I'll connect you." Naomi left the cafe feeling lighter than she had in months, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally lifted. When she told Caleb about the meeting later that evening, his face lit up with pride. "See? This is your chance," he said. "Go show them what you're made of." But life didn't pause just because hope had returned. A few nights later, Caleb woke to the sound of shattering glass. He rushed outside to find the diner's front window smashed and graffiti scrawled across the brick wall, "Race mixing ruins towns." The words were jagged, angry, and unmistakably meant for him and Naomi. Naomi joined him in the cold night air, wrapping her arms around herself as she read the hateful message. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Together, they grabbed cleaning supplies and scrubbed the wall until their hands were raw and the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. It was exhausting, heartbreaking work, but somehow, doing it together made it bearable. Despite the ugliness of that night, Naomi pressed on. The indie shoot connected by Yvonne turned out to be everything she needed, a chance to prove to herself that she belonged in front of the camera. The photographer, a kind man named Marcus, encouraged her to let go of her insecurities and embrace her uniqueness. "You've got fire in you," he said during a break. "Let it show." When the photos were published online a few weeks later, Naomi scrolled through the indie fashion blog with tears streaming down her face. There she was, her image bold and unapologetic, staring back at her from the screen. For the first time, she didn't see flaws or doubts. She saw strength. She saw beauty. She saw herself. Caleb found her sitting on the edge of their bed, phone in hand, tears still glistening on her cheeks. Without a word, he sat beside her, pulling her close. "You're already becoming who you were meant to be," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "I'm so proud of you." Naomi leaned into him, letting the warmth of his embrace wash over her. It wasn't easy, nothing worth fighting for ever was, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were winning. Not just against the hate or the struggles, but against the voices inside her head that had tried to convince her she wasn't enough. And in that quiet, intimate moment, surrounded by love and resilience, Naomi knew one thing for certain: she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as Caleb was flipping pancakes at the diner. Naomi's phone buzzed insistently on the counter, and when she answered, her face lit up like he hadn't seen in weeks. "It's official," she said breathlessly after hanging up. "I got the gig, a small modeling tour across the Southeast. It's not New York or LA, but it's real work. I'm finally leaving this town." Caleb forced a smile, though his stomach churned with a mix of pride and dread. He knew how much this meant to her, how hard she'd fought for it, but the thought of her leaving left him hollow. Still, he swallowed his unease and pulled her into a tight hug. "This is amazing," he said, trying to sound convincing. "You deserve every bit of it." Over the next few days, they threw themselves into preparations. Caleb planned a goodbye party at the diner, inviting everyone who had supported them, even if it was just a handful of regulars. He wanted to send Naomi off with love, laughter, and a celebration of everything she'd overcome. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The night of the party arrived, and the diner buzzed with energy. Neighbors brought homemade dishes, Marcus, the indie photographer, played music on an old guitar, and Miss Yvonne even called in to congratulate Naomi over speakerphone. For a while, it felt like the universe had finally aligned in their favor. Naomi laughed freely, her eyes sparkling as she moved from table to table, thanking everyone for believing in her. But then, chaos erupted. Smoke began seeping through the cracks in the walls, followed by shouts of alarm. Someone yelled, "Fire," and suddenly the room dissolved into panic. Caleb grabbed Naomi's hand and ushered her outside, where flames were already licking at the edges of the building. They stood together in stunned silence, watching as the diner, their sanctuary, their home, was consumed by fire. By the time the firefighters arrived, there wasn't much left to save. The blaze had spread too quickly, fueled by grease traps and decades-old wood. Caleb stared at the charred remains, his chest tight with disbelief. This wasn't just a diner, it was his livelihood, his dream, his anchor. And now it was gone. In the days that followed, the weight of reality settled heavily upon them. The insurance payout wouldn't cover the full cost of rebuilding, and without the diner, Caleb didn't know how they'd make ends meet. Naomi wrestled with guilt, convinced that her departure had somehow cursed them. "Maybe I should cancel the tour," she said one evening, pacing the tiny apartment above the ashes of the diner. "Stay here and help you rebuild." Caleb shook his head firmly. "No way. You've worked too hard for this. Go. Do what you were meant to do. I'll figure things out, I promise." "But what about us?" Naomi asked, tears streaming down her face. "What if we lose each other because of this?" Caleb stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. "We won't lose each other. Not ever. Because we're stronger than all of this. You go show the world who you are, and I'll be right here waiting for you when you come back." Their final days together were bittersweet. They spent hours talking about the future, about the diner Caleb swore he'd rebuild and the career Naomi hoped would take her places neither of them could yet imagine. On the morning of her departure, they walked to the bus stop hand in hand, the rain falling steadily around them. At the station, Naomi clung to Caleb, unwilling to let go. "I'll call you every day," she promised, her voice trembling. "And I'll come back as soon as I can." "I'll be here," Caleb replied, forcing a smile despite the ache in his chest. "Always." As the bus pulled away, Caleb stood in the drizzling rain, watching until the taillights disappeared into the distance. His heart felt heavy, but also full. Naomi was chasing her dreams, and that mattered more than anything. Even if it meant standing alone for now, he knew they'd find their way back to each other. Because sometimes, love means letting go so the other person can grow. And Caleb was willing to do whatever it took to see Naomi bloom, even if it meant facing the fire first. The modeling tour was everything Naomi had dreamed of, and more. Each city brought new opportunities, new faces, and a growing sense of confidence she hadn't felt in years. She walked runways in converted warehouses, posed for indie designers under neon lights, and even landed a feature in a regional fashion magazine. For the first time in her life, people weren't looking at her with pity or judgment, they were seeing her as an artist, a creator, someone worth celebrating. But fame has a way of complicating things. One evening, after a particularly successful show in Atlanta, a scout approached her backstage. His name was Greg, and he worked for one of the biggest agencies on the East Coast. He shook her hand firmly, his smile polished but calculating. "You've got something special," he said, his tone smooth as silk. "We'd love to bring you on board." Naomi's heart raced. This was it, the break she'd been waiting for. But then Greg leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "There's just one thing. You'll need to downplay your personal life. Specifically, your marriage. A fresh face like yours needs mystery, not baggage." Her stomach dropped. Downplay her marriage? Pretend Caleb didn't exist? The thought made her sick. "I can't do that," she said quickly, shaking her head. "My husband is part of who I am." Greg shrugged, unfazed. "Suit yourself. But let me be clear, this industry doesn't reward loyalty. It rewards ambition. Think about it." As she walked back to her hotel room, Naomi felt torn. On one hand, this was the chance of a lifetime, an opportunity to step onto a bigger stage, to prove herself in ways she'd only imagined. On the other hand, denying Caleb felt like betraying the very foundation of who she was. How could she succeed if it meant losing herself in the process? Meanwhile, back in their small South Carolina town, Caleb was hard at work rebuilding the diner. The fire had left him with nothing but ashes and memories, but the community rallied around him in unexpected ways. Neighbors stopped by with tools and supplies. Miss Yvonne sent a generous donation along with a note that read, "Dreams rise from the ashes." Even some of the townsfolk who had once whispered about Naomi pitched in, moved by Caleb's quiet determination. Every hammer strike, every nail driven into wood, reminded Caleb of Naomi. He thought about her laugh, her strength, the way she lit up a room without even trying. Rebuilding the diner wasn't just about restoring a business, it was about holding on to hope. Hope that when Naomi returned, they'd have something solid to come back to. But while Caleb focused on reconstruction, Naomi faced a new kind of challenge. One morning, as she scrolled through social media during a rare moment of downtime, she stumbled upon an article Lena Parker had published. The headline screamed, "From diner waitress to runway star, the love story behind Naomi Carter's rise." At first glance, it seemed harmless enough, a glowing account of Naomi's journey and her relationship with Caleb. But as she read further, nausea crept over her. Lena had twisted their story, painting Caleb as a naive dreamer who held Naomi back until fate intervened. Worse still, the article hinted at scandal, implying that Naomi's success came at the expense of her marriage. Comments poured in, ranging from supportive to vicious. Some accused her of using Caleb, others called her ungrateful. Furious, Naomi dialed Lena's number, her hands trembling. When Lena answered, her voice dripped with faux innocence. "Oh, Naomi. I'm so glad you saw the article. Isn't it wonderful?" "Wonderful?" Naomi spat, barely containing her rage. "You twisted our story, Lena. You made us look like some sordid drama instead of two people who love each other." Lena sighed dramatically, as if bored by Naomi's outrage. "Come on, darling. Fame costs. If you want to play in the big leagues, you learn to take a few hits. Besides, controversy sells." "You're disgusting," Naomi shot back before hanging up. She stared at her phone, anger simmering beneath her skin. Lena's words echoed in her mind, "Fame costs." But how much was too much? Was she willing to sacrifice her truth, her integrity, for the sake of success? That night, Naomi sat alone in her hotel room, staring out at the city skyline. She thought about Caleb, about the diner, about the life they'd built together despite every obstacle thrown their way. No matter what happened next, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't lose sight of who she was, or who they were, together. Because no amount of fame was worth losing the person she loved most. The tabloid struck without warning. One morning, Naomi woke up to find her face plastered across the front page of a trashy magazine with a headline that made her stomach churn, "Modeling star's shocking lies about her past exposed." The article painted her as a fraud, claiming she had fabricated her humble beginnings to gain sympathy. They even dug up old photos of her car and accused her of staging her homeless phase for publicity. Naomi stared at the screen in disbelief, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the comments section. Strangers tore her apart, calling her a liar, a manipulator, someone who didn't deserve her success. It felt like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling all over again. How could they twist her truth into something so ugly? And worse, how could anyone believe it? But the tabloid scandal was only the beginning. A few days later, Detective Cruz showed up backstage after one of Naomi's shows. Tall and stern, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, he introduced himself as part of an investigation into the modeling agency she'd recently signed with. Rumors of exploitation, harassment, and coercion had surfaced, and Naomi's name kept popping up in testimonies from other models. "I need you to tell me everything," Detective Crew said, his voice firm but kind. "Even if it feels small. Especially if it feels small." Naomi hesitated, fear gripping her chest. Talking meant risking her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked so hard for. But staying silent felt wrong, like betraying not just herself but every other model caught in the same web. So she told him everything, the late-night demands, the pressure to conform, the subtle threats disguised as advice. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. Meanwhile, back in South Carolina, Caleb received a frantic call from the hospital. Frank Reed, the gruff mechanic who had always glared at Naomi with quiet disdain, had collapsed at his shop. Caleb rushed to the emergency room, his heart pounding. For years, Frank had been a symbol of the town's disapproval, a man whose silence spoke louder than words. But now, lying pale and fragile in a hospital bed, he looked human. When Caleb entered the room, Frank motioned weakly for him to come closer. "Listen," Frank rasped, his voice barely audible. "I've been a damn fool. About you. About her." He paused, swallowing hard. "She's good people, Caleb. Better than any of us gave her credit for. And you're lucky to have her." Caleb blinked, stunned. He hadn't expected an apology, especially not from Frank. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." As Caleb sat by Frank's bedside, Naomi called. Her voice cracked as soon as she heard Caleb pick up. "They want me to hide you," she whispered, choking back sobs. "The agency says being married is bad for my image. They're pushing me to deny we're together, to erase you completely." Caleb closed his eyes, pain slicing through him. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "Then let them push. I'd rather be invisible than let you forget who you are. You hear me? This isn't about hiding or running away. It's about standing tall, no matter what they throw at you." Naomi cried harder, relief mingling with guilt. She wanted to argue, to tell him she couldn't bear losing him, but deep down, she knew he was right. Love wasn't about erasing each other, it was about holding on to the truth, even when the world tried to tear it apart. By the time she hung up, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter, not gone, but manageable. Because Caleb believed in her. And as long as he did, she could face anything. Naomi stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the counter behind her, texts from the agency, emails marked urgent, calls she let go straight to voicemail. She knew what they wanted, for her to sign the contract, to play their game, to deny Caleb and rewrite her story into something palatable for the masses. But as she looked at herself, really looked, she realized she couldn't do it. Not anymore. She grabbed a pen and scrawled 2 words across the official document they'd sent her, "I decline." Then she walked out of her hotel room, leaving behind everything she thought she wanted, the glitz, the glamour, the validation, and headed towards something far more important, truth. Word spread quickly after that. A major women's rights blog picked up Naomi's story, framing her decision as an act of courage against an industry rife with exploitation and misogyny. The article went viral, painting Naomi not as a victim but as a trailblazer, a woman who refused to compromise her values for fame. Comments poured in from women around the world, thanking her for standing firm and reminding them that success doesn't have to come at the cost of self-respect. But the surprises didn't stop there. A few weeks later, Miss Yvonne called Naomi with news that left her breathless. "I've arranged a live casting with Legacy and Company," Yvonne said, her voice brimming with pride. "They're looking for authenticity, and darling, no one embodies that better than you." Legacy and Company wasn't just any brand, it was iconic, timeless, the kind of name that carried weight in every corner of the fashion world. Naomi's hands trembled as she stepped into the casting room, surrounded by designers and photographers whose work she had admired for years. When they asked her to walk, she did so with every ounce of confidence she'd fought to build. And when the head designer nodded approvingly, saying, "You're exactly who we've been searching for," Naomi felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her first high-profile runway show took place under dazzling lights, with cameras flashing and crowds cheering. As she walked, head held high, Naomi thought about how far she'd come, from washing dishes in Caleb's diner to owning the stage in front of thousands. But more than anything, she thought about Caleb. About the man who had believed in her when no one else did, who had loved her without condition, who had taught her that true strength comes from staying true to yourself. Back in South Carolina, Caleb was putting the finishing touches on the newly rebuilt diner. This time, he'd made sure it reflected not just his dreams but theirs together. On one wall, a mural of Naomi stretched floor to ceiling, a vibrant, larger-than-life portrait capturing her resilience and beauty. Above it, in bold letters, read the words, **, dreams are built together. **. The grand reopening brought the whole town out. Neighbors filled the booths, sharing plates of ribs and biscuits while marveling at the transformation. Even Frank Reed showed up, rolling himself in a wheelchair to the front door. He wore a hat pulled low over his forehead, but the smile tugging at his lips gave him away. Caleb greeted him warmly, pulling out a chair so Frank could sit near the mural. "You did good, kid," Frank said gruffly, nodding toward the painting. "Both of you." Caleb grinned, shaking his head. "We couldn't have done it without people like you, Frank. Without everyone pitching in." Frank snorted, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude, but his gaze lingered on the mural. It was clear he saw Naomi differently now, not as the outsider everyone had judged, but as the heart of a story none of them would soon forget. That night, as the diner buzzed with laughter and music, Caleb stepped outside for a moment of quiet. He stared at the stars, letting the cool breeze wash over him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an incoming video call from Naomi. He answered immediately, his heart leaping at the sight of her face. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice warm despite the distance between them. "It's perfect," Caleb replied, smiling. "Just like I knew it would be. Everyone's here, including Frank." Naomi laughed softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Tell him I said thank you. For everything." "I will," Caleb promised. "And hey, you were incredible tonight. I'm so proud of you." Naomi smiled back, her expression softening. "None of this would have been possible without you, Caleb. You gave me the courage to keep going, even when I didn't think I could." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them heavy with love and understanding. They were miles apart, yet closer than ever, two halves of a whole determined to build something beautiful out of broken pieces. Because sometimes, the greatest comebacks aren't the ones we see on runways or in headlines. Sometimes, they happen quietly, in the hearts of those brave enough to believe in second chances. The day Naomi returned to town, it felt like the whole world had turned out to welcome her home. Cars lined Main Street, their windows decorated with handmade signs that read *, "Welcome back, Naomi." *, "We're proud of you." A parade snaked through the heart of the town, led by a float adorned with flowers and photographs of Naomi's journey, from washing dishes at Caleb's diner to walking runways for Legacy and Company. Children waved tiny American flags, and old-timers tipped their hats as she passed by in an open-top car, her hand raised in greeting. Naomi couldn't help but laugh, tears streaming down her cheeks as she took it all in. This was the same town that had once whispered behind her back, judged her choices, doubted her worth. But now? Now they were cheering, for her, for Caleb, for the life they'd built together despite every obstacle thrown their way. It was surreal, humbling, and more than a little overwhelming. Karen Malloy stood near the edge of the crowd, clutching a bouquet of wilting daisies. When Naomi stepped off the float and approached her, Karen swallowed hard, her face flushed with shame. I just wanted to say," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. For everything." For a moment, Naomi simply looked at her, the woman who had once refused to serve her at the grocery store, who had reported her online profile, who had done everything in her power to tear Naomi down. Then she smiled, a soft, forgiving smile, and took the flowers from Karen's hands. "Thank you," she said gently. "But let's not dwell on the past, okay? We've all grown since then." With that, Naomi turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing there, stunned but oddly relieved. Forgiveness wasn't something Naomi gave lightly, but she knew holding on to bitterness would only weigh her down. And besides, this town, flawed and complicated as it was finally starting to feel like home. Later that evening, Caleb joined Naomi on the porch of their new house, a cozy little place nestled between the diner and the community center they'd recently purchased together. They sipped sweet tea as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. "Did you hear about the reality show offer?" Caleb asked casually, though his tone betrayed his amusement. Naomi groaned, rolling her eyes. "Don't remind me. Like we need cameras following us around 24/7. Besides, our lives are already dramatic enough without adding producers into the mix." Caleb chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "True. Still, it's nice to know people care." "They don't just care," Naomi replied, her voice softening. "They see us now. Really see us. And I think, maybe we can use that to make things better, not just for us, but for everyone." Her words sparked an idea that quickly grew into action. Within months, Naomi opened a modeling school for underprivileged girls, teaching them not just how to walk or pose but how to carry themselves with confidence and grace. The classes filled up immediately, drawing students from neighboring towns and even nearby cities. Miss Yvonne flew in to teach workshops, her no-nonsense approach earning her both respect and admiration. Meanwhile, Caleb's restaurant flourished beyond anything he'd ever imagined. What started as a humble diner became a chain, each location featuring murals of Naomi alongside quotes about perseverance and unity. People came not just for the food but for the story, the tale of two people who refused to give up on each other or their dreams. Together, Naomi and Caleb transformed the old community center into a hub of hope and opportunity. It housed art classes, job training programs, and support groups for families in need. On weekends, it hosted farmers markets and live music performances, drawing crowds from miles away. The mural of Naomi still hung proudly inside, surrounded by photos of smiling faces and handwritten notes of gratitude. One evening, as they stood side by side watching the sunset over the bustling town square, Naomi slipped her hand into Caleb's. "You know," she said quietly, "when I first came here, I thought this place would eat me alive. But now I realize it saved me." Caleb squeezed her hand, his gaze steady and warm. "We saved each other," he corrected. "And look what we've done. Look what we've built." Naomi nodded, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. They hadn't just changed their own lives, they'd changed the lives of everyone around them. The town that had once judged them now looked to them as leaders, as inspirations. And while the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, they faced it together, with love, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the power of second chances. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't measured in fame or fortune. Sometimes, they're found in the simple act of coming home, and building a future worth staying for. The lights of New York City sparkled like a galaxy scattered across the skyline as Naomi stepped onto the stage at the annual Legacy Awards. The room was packed with industry titans, celebrities, and journalists, all clapping as she accepted her award for outstanding contribution to fashion and community empowerment. Her name echoed through the grand ballroom, but it wasn't just her name, it was a symbol of resilience, of breaking barriers, of rewriting what the world thought possible. Caleb sat near the front row, his chest swelling with pride as he watched Naomi take the microphone. She looked radiant in a custom-designed gown, its flowing fabric adorned with subtle embroidery that told her story: humble beginnings, fiery determination, unyielding love. As she began to speak, her voice carried not just gratitude but wisdom earned through years of struggle. "I used to think success meant proving myself to others," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Caleb. "But I've learned something far more important. Success is about staying true to who you are, no matter how loud the world tries to drown you out. It's about building bridges where there were walls, creating spaces where dreams can grow, even when people say they won't." Her words resonated deeply, earning a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. But the moment that hit hardest came later, back in their small South Carolina town, inside the cozy studio of Naomi's modeling school. A group of kids, bright-eyed girls from underprivileged backgrounds, sat cross-legged on the floor, looking up at Naomi with admiration and curiosity. One of them, a shy girl named Lily with braids tied neatly with ribbons, raised her hand hesitantly. "Miss Naomi," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if the world says no? What if they tell us we're not good enough?" Naomi knelt down so she was eye level with the children, her expression soft but fierce. "Then we build a world where yes lives," she replied, her tone unwavering. "We don't wait for permission to shine. We create our own light, and then we share it with everyone around us. Because when one of us rises, we all rise." The girls nodded, their faces lighting up with understanding. For many of them, Naomi wasn't just a teacher, she was proof that the impossible could become possible. Proof that dreams weren't reserved for those born into privilege, but for anyone brave enough to chase them. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting golden hues across the streets of their once hostile town, Naomi and Caleb walked hand in hand. The diner glowed warmly in the distance, its mural now a landmark beloved by locals and tourists alike. Children played in the square outside the community center, laughter filling the air like music. Even Frank Reed waved from his porch, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. Naomi glanced at Caleb, her heart full. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd given up?" she asked softly. Caleb shook his head, squeezing her hand. "Nope. Because this, right here, right now, is exactly where we're supposed to be." As they strolled past familiar faces nodding in greeting, past murals and memories etched into every corner of the town, the camera pulled back slowly, capturing the couple against the backdrop of a community transformed. Then, just as the screen faded to black, a voiceover whispered. Asterisk, they laughed when he married her. Now they want to be her. Asterisk. And with that, the credits rolled, leaving behind a story of love, courage, and the power to rewrite even the harshest narratives. At its heart, this story is about more than just Naomi and Caleb, it's about the power of staying true to who you are, even when the world tells you to be someone else. It's about love that doesn't just endure but grows stronger under pressure. And it's about resilience, the kind that refuses to let setbacks define you. Naomi taught us that success isn't measured by accolades or fame but by the lives we touch along the way. She showed us that when the world says no, we have the power to build a world where yes thrives. Caleb reminded us that love isn't about possession, it's about partnership. He believed in Naomi when she struggled to believe in herself, and together, they proved that two people united by purpose can overcome anything. Their journey also highlights the importance of community. From Frank Reed's unexpected apology to Karen Malloy's redemption arc, this story reminds us that people, and towns, can change. Growth isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. By choosing forgiveness over bitterness, Naomi and Caleb didn't just transform their own lives, they transformed an entire town. So what can we take away from this? First, never underestimate the strength of authenticity. In a world that often pressures us to conform, standing firm in your truth is the bravest thing you can do. Second, surround yourself with people who lift you up, challenge you, and remind you of your worth, even on days when you forget it yourself. Finally, remember that every setback is a setup for something greater. Life may knock you down, but it's your choice whether to stay there or rise again. Call to action, don't miss what happens next. If this story resonated with you, if it made you laugh, cry, or think deeply about your own life, then don't miss out on the next chapter of inspiration. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release another unforgettable tale. Because stories like this one don't come around often, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Reflections and comments. This narrative strikes a chord because it mirrors real life, messy, unpredictable, yet profoundly beautiful. The characters of Naomi and Caleb feel authentic, not perfect heroes, but flawed human beings navigating challenges many of us face. Their struggles with identity, societal judgment, and personal growth reflect universal truths, making their victories all the more satisfying. One viewer might say, "This story gave me hope. It reminded me that no matter how hard things get, I can still create my own path." Another could comment, "I loved how Naomi and Caleb stayed true to themselves while lifting others up. That's the kind of legacy we should all strive for." What did you think? Did Naomi's determination inspire you? Did Caleb's unwavering support make you believe in love again? Share your thoughts below, we'd love to hear how this story impacted you. And remember, every great journey starts with a single step. Take yours today.